Of all the pioneers of the Canadian music industry, two names stand out: Walt Grealis and Stan Klees. Together, Walt and Stan helped to build a music scene in Canada that is still thriving. In 1964, they launched a weekly industry magazine called RPM, and then co-created the Juno Awards. Stan remembers that the Canadian record industry was a lot different in the early days.
Most of the industry in Canada was the distribution of American hits in those days, and when a record became a hit on Billboard, they would put it out in Canada. If it wasn't a hit, they wouldn't. The record companies up here, it was like a piggy bank for the American companies.
Klees began his career as a teenage disc jockey, then went to work for London Records, and later Astral Distributors. Stan says that back in the day, getting Canadian radio stations to play Canadian records was nearly impossible.
When you walked into a radio station and you had a Canadian record, I can remember one incident where I walked into a station, and at that time the rock and roll business was going very strong. And the guy opened the little envelopes that they got from the record companies, looked at it, and he said, "Canadian shit," threw it against a cement block wall and shattered and fell to the floor. And that sort of stuck with me. I got bitten and started putting records out in Canada made by Canadian artists, and tried to fight that battle.
While working at London Records, Stan became close friends with American singer Bobby Darin. On an early visit to Canada, Darin was stranded in Toronto due to heavy fog. Klees brought Bobby home and played him some of his favorite records.
We stayed up till about 3 o'clock in the morning listening to different things. Mac the Knife was one of my favorite songs, and also Beyond the Sea, because I was a great fan of Kurt Weill. And I said to Bobby, you know, it'd be great somebody did a version of Mac the Knife in sort of a jazz up-tempo thing. And I've never claimed being in any way responsible for that, because that's a pissing contest I don't want to indulge in. When he did that song, he phoned me and he said, I want to dedicate the album to you. And he played Mac the Knife and he played Beyond the Sea to me on the telephone, and they came out later and became very successful for him.
Through his friendship with Bobby Darin, Stan spent a lot of time in New York City, and that's where he met legendary record producer Bob Crewe.
Bob Crewe was the genius behind the Four Seasons. I sat in on sessions where he was recording people. At that time, he had just discovered the Four Seasons. He used to say to them, no, you sound like the Crew Cuts, you sound like the Four Lads. No, Frankie, like this. And he'd get Frankie go into the falsettos. And they resisted him all the way. They just didn't want to sound like that. They did want to sound like the Crew Cuts and like the Four Lads. And I was so proud because both the Crew Cuts and the Four Lads were Canadian. The Bob Crewe connection got me interested in recording in Canada.
Stan came back to Canada and started recording with a vengeance.
So what I learned from the studios in New York, and I was very lucky, I was taught a great deal of how to do things in studios, and I employed all that into the studios here. They were very primitive, but all of a sudden we came up from a very good sound from the floor, a remarkable sound, and people started calling it the Toronto Sound. That was just around 1963-64.
One of Stan's earliest chart successes was the song Big Town Boy by Shirley Matthews, which came out on Stan's Tamarac label.
Big Town Boy was as good a Canadian hit as you could have in those days, and you could never have anything from coast to coast. Everybody was working with consultants from the United States and said, these are the 40 records you play, and you only play these. So they simply followed that pattern, and there was no way to get a Canadian record in there. But Big Town Boys did get on the American charts. That sort of started things as far as being a producer and working with Canadian artists.
After Tamarac Records, Stan and partners Art Snyder and Duff Roman launched the Red Leaf label.
At that time, I had found a leaf in my driveway which had just turned red, and I took it and sealed it between two pieces of plastic, and I thought, this is what I'm going to use for my next label. I couldn't find it when the time came, so I had to put something together in a hurry, and I put together the Red Leaf label.
In 1965, Stan produced a song he'd discovered in New York called My Girl Sloopy.
Hang on, Sloopy, Sloopy, hang on.
The group was Little Caesar and the Consuls. Stan was sure it was a hit, and he was right. After Little Caesar's version hit the U.S. record charts, Stan received a phone call from a friend in New York who told him,
"You're the darling of New York. Everybody loves the record. Everybody says million seller, #1. So she said, that's the good news. Now the bad news is you're being covered by people on," and she named the labels that were covering me, all of them doing an imitation of this. The next phone call was, Wes Farrell and Burt Burns have just started a label named Bang Records, and they also wrote My Girl Sloopy. So they've got a group called the McCoys, and they're flying them in from Miami, and they've got your record, and they're learning it on the plane, and they're going to cover it when they come to New York. So I said, well, there's nothing we can do about that. And I said to my group, they want you to tour the United States and promote the records. And they said, well, why would we do that? We're getting good money. From the record, we're getting good money doing gigs around Canada. We're getting like $200. Why should we go to the States and work for nothing just to promote a record? And I said, well, that's how records are promoted. And they said, no, we're going to stay here. We got a gig, we got family. We don't want to travel around the United States. So I said, well, that's fine.
During the McCoys' recording session, the producers sped up the tempo and changed the name of the song from My Girl Sloopy to Hang On Sloopy.
The McCoys record came out, and the McCoys became a million seller.
It was during a lunch in 1964 with Stan, longtime friend and business partner Walt Grealis, music publisher Harold Moon, and Buffalo, New York disc jockey George the Hound Lorenz that the idea for a Canadian weekly industry magazine first came up.
George Lorenz said, what Canada needs is an East-West dialogue instead of the North-South dialogue that's going on now. So we walked out there, Walt said, could we start a tip sheet like that? And I said, sure, we should start it small and then it grows from there. So we put it out on one piece of paper and sent it out to the chart stations and printed what was going on. And it grew from that to a larger format and then grew to a glossy magazine with pictures.
The first edition of RPM, which stands for Records, Promotion, Music, was published on February 24, 1964. Later that same year, Walt and Stan created an annual award ceremony to honor Canadian musicians.
The original concept was building a star system in Canada, which meant the established artists introduced the new artists, and we built a star system.
That original concept went on to become the Juno Awards.
It was called then the annual RPM Gold Leaf Award. But in the interim, we nicknamed it the Juno Awards, named after Pierre Juno, the chairman of the CRTC that brought in the content regulation and was so interested in Canadian content. In the first Juno Awards, we had catering for the sandwiches, and we brought our own liquor. We invited, I think, 75 people, and 150 arrived, and the sandwiches were gone in 15 minutes. And the liquor was gone in 20 minutes. The second year, we couldn't move, because at that time we'd invited a lot of people, and my mother made the sandwiches with 4 of her lady friends, and those are the famous sandwiches that people talk about when they talk about the first Juno Awards.
The last RPM Weekly was published in December of 2000. In 1971, the Juno Awards became the responsibility of CARAS, the Canadian Academy of Recording Arts and Sciences. Stan Klees is proud to have been a co-founder of both.
When you do something in the record business, it's the nature of the business not to get credit for it, number one. Number two, Walt and I were never media darlings. Walt got recognized because he got the Order of Canada, and he's an officer in the Order of Canada. That's pretty high status for an Order of Canada, for a guy that put out a magazine once a week. So there was a certain amount of recognition, but do I feel proud about it? I did it for a reason. I did it for a very selfish reason. It's something that I wanted to do that would make me feel good if I accomplished it. And the sad part is that Walt passed away before it came into fruition to the extent that it is now. And he did see the beginning of that, and he was very self-satisfied with everything that he did. But it would have been nice if he stayed a little bit longer and seen how it is today, because today it's practically hysterical compared to what it was when we started.